Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Amy Giroux, joining you live from my home to yours, from Gatineau, Quebec, to across Canada and around the globe. We're here today to bring you some great news. But before we get started, we would like to pay tribute to all the friends and families in Nova Scotia who have been affected by Canada's worst massive shooting in the history of our country. We are sending our thoughts, our prayers, and our hugs, right, to help Nova Scotia stay strong, and you're in our hearts and minds. Thank you for joining with us all today. As we promised from our last episode of Some Great News, we have with us today, live from Washington, D.C., Mahesh Uttamchandani from the World Bank, who's also from Global Vision's very beginning years in 1991. Thank you, Mahesh, for joining us today.
Thanks, Amy. Thanks for having me. And I just want to echo your sentiment to everyone in Nova Scotia. Our thoughts, even down here in the States, are with everybody.
Yeah, it's quite something else. And I can't think of a worse place that it happened to, because the Maritimers, everyone knows it's not 7 degrees of separation, it's 1, right? Everybody knows someone. So our thoughts are with them, and that's why we're here to help to highlight what good news we can bring, some great news to keep everybody sane in these moments. So Mahesh, now that you're at the World Bank and in the area of small business, which we know has been affected big time by the COVID, I was wondering how the World Bank is tracking this issue.
Sure. Thanks, Amy. So, we're very concerned about what's happening to small businesses. You probably know that even before the COVID crisis, there was a hundreds of billions of dollars financing gap for small businesses around the world. In other words, they already weren't getting the financing they need. And depending on how you measure the size of a small business, they represent something in the order of 60% of global employment. So this is a serious issue even before the crisis. What this crisis has done, though, I think, is exacerbated the challenges for small businesses in 4 big ways. Number one, of course, is falling demand, right? Every business everywhere is going to face falling demand because of the various lockdowns, because consumers are losing their own jobs, and because there's a hesitation to spend generally. There's also reduced input supply. We see that global supply chains are fraying a little bit under the travel restrictions, again, under the lockdown. And so businesses aren't getting the basic inputs that they need, even if there was demand that they needed to supply. But then we see a real tightening of credit conditions. So it's just getting a lot harder to get any liquidity as any kind of business. But again, particularly as a small business, this is always going to be harder, and they are going to be more affected by this crisis. And then the last one, I think, is just rising uncertainty. We're all uncertain in our personal lives, our professional lives, our business lives, and I think that creates a big challenge for small businesses. So what are we doing in the World Bank? I think a couple of things we've been able to do very quickly that I'm very proud of is we've been able to approve through a fast-track process an initial tranche of $14 billion in emergency financing, partly dedicated towards the health aspects of this crisis, because remember that a lot of the countries we work with, the emerging market and developing economies, don't have the financial space to purchase the basic things they need to respond to the health aspects of this crisis, whether that's building quarantine facilities, whether that's buying ventilators, whether that's even buying hospital beds. So part of that initial 14 billion tranche is dedicated towards that, but about 6 billion of it is going towards, or I should say about 8 billion, is going towards businesses and lenders in emerging markets through our private sector arm, the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. And that's partly to recapitalize the financial sectors in emerging markets to make sure that they can lend and provide the liquidity that businesses need, but also to make sure that businesses that need support directly from us, that we can provide it to, get it. Now, 14 billion, as you can imagine, is a big amount, but it's not a huge amount in the context of this crisis. We've also fast-tracked an additional 146 billion to be deployed over the next year to year and a half to combat the economic and social impacts of the crisis. And this is where I think we can really address some of the challenges for small businesses. So if I go back to the four kind of challenges small businesses are going to experience during this crisis, the question becomes, how do we address those challenges? I think one way that we've seen work in previous crises, whether it's the Asian crisis in the late 90s or whether it's the global financial crisis 10 years ago, is how can you create backstop guarantees that incentivize the private sector to continue to finance these firms? So we rely in many countries on the banking sector to do its job and play its role and be a good facilitator, an intermediator of credit. And they know how to do that better than most people. But how do you take some of the risk away from them so that they can lend to some of these riskier businesses? And part of the way you do that is through something called a partial credit guarantee, right? And Canada has done this for years for small businesses. And you can provide a guarantee that guarantees either a first loss or second loss basis a certain amount of the debt that's owing by these businesses. And that takes some of the risk away from the lender. Now, what we can do as an institution is we can help finance the master facility, if you will, or the high-level fund that will then fund these guarantee facilities. And we'll certainly be doing that. Another thing we'll be doing as part of this overall funding that I talked about earlier is to provide the creation of small business lending facilities. So a facility that might sit with the central bank or that might sit with a national development bank in a country, and that would then on-lend directly to small and medium enterprises. And depending on the economy, you might focus on small and medium enterprises that are in the tech sector. You might focus on ones that are led by women. That has to be designed at country level. But I think what we can do is provide some of the liquidity that funds that. Now, the other thing you need to do is to create the right conditions in country for small businesses to thrive. That's something we do through what we call technical assistance, which is really working with policymakers on the ground in developing countries to help design the right policies. And I think this, this crisis presents actually a great opportunity to get it right, if you will, on the ground in terms of some of these provisions. And we'll be doing that across a set of issues in the financial and private sectors, whether it's tax policy, whether it's introducing innovative tools like factoring or asset-based lending, whether it's getting debt repayment and bankruptcy systems right. We'll be looking at the whole range of things with the countries we work with, seeing where their priorities are and how we can help create the right environment for small businesses to grow and thrive. And part of that's going to be through an instrument we use called development policy lending, where we actually provide budget support to countries that are struggling. And as part of that package of budget support, there's a set of reforms that the country will implement. And then the last thing I'll say is, let's not forget about the informal businesses. In Canada, that's a relatively small part of the economy, but in a lot of developing countries, it's a very, very large part and a very large part of employment. And we need to think about how we reach these informal businesses. And often an informal business is a one-woman or a one-man shop. And if you think about a developing country, you think about a shoe repair shop on the corner or even a local coffee stand. That's a one-person shop, but it's important. It feeds a whole family often, or an extended family. And so we need to think about how to reach these businesses that are sort of so-called off the grid. And I think one of the ways we can do that is a lot of countries are looking at social cash transfers to their populations to try and replace some of the lost income the population faces. And in the case of an informal business, if you reach the owner of the business, well, you're, even in her personal capacity, you're reaching the business. And so we want to think about how to smooth the process of making these cash transfers. And a lot of that's going to be done through things like mobile banking and innovative fintech solutions that help get this money out in a more secure and cheap way to these populations. So I know that's a very long answer to your original question, but I wanted to give you a sense of the various things we're doing across the board, which we hope will help blunt the impact of this crisis for small businesses.
Well, thank you, Mahesh, for sharing that valuable insight with us because, well, as we know here in Canada, small and medium-sized businesses are really the heart of our nation, right? And we all have to take care of one another to really help to rebuild both of our economies. Now, I'd like to switch gears for a moment because I also understand you were with another Canadian icon, Alex Trebek, on the infamous television show Jeopardy. Could you tell us a little bit about that experience?
Sure. Well, I mean, you know me, Amy. I've been a nerd my whole life, and I've been a Jeopardy nerd since I was in high school. My 10th grade high school Latin teacher, Peter Johnson, used to wheel in a TV. And for those of you a lot younger than me on this, listening to this, we used to have TVs on carts in schools that got wheeled in by teachers, sometimes on days they didn't feel like teaching us.
Yeah.
And he would pop in a VHS cassette of last night's Jeopardy episode, and we would watch it. And I just fell in love with the show, and it's something I've passed on to my daughters. We watch it together pretty much every night when we can, when I'm not traveling. And so it's been an aspiration of mine to be on the show. There are about 80,000 folks every year who do the online test for the show. About 4,000 of them get invited to a regional in-person audition. And when you show up at the in-person audition, it's usually in a hotel ballroom, and you actually play a mock game against two other people. You do another timed test in a room with a bunch of very smart people, and you do an interview. And from that 4,000, 350 to 375 get invited to be on the show every year. So when I made it to the group of 4,000, I thought, you know what, this is just fun. I'm going to meet some fellow Jeopardy nerds, and I'll get a nice tote bag and a pen to take home, and that can be my bragging rights. And then about 8 months later, I was home, working late in the evening, and I got a call from California from a number I didn't recognize. Picked it up, and it was one of the contestant coordinators. And he said to me, "Can you come out here in 30 days, and we'll film your episode January 7th, and it'll be on TV on March 6th." So I spent all of the Christmas holidays studying. And just an interesting thing that there's no reason why anyone would know, but that I find funny, is the thing that most closely approximates a Jeopardy buzzer, the feel in your hand and the pressing down, is actually that little spring-loaded toilet roll holder that most of us have in our bathrooms that we've never thought about. So I would stand in front of my TV throughout the Christmas holidays with episodes of Jeopardy playing, and me holding a toilet roll holder, trying to pretend I was buzzing in. And when we got to the show, I can't tell you what a lovely guy Alex Trebek is. He was unfortunately in so much pain when we were filming our episode, and you could see that he was uncomfortable because of the illness he's struggling with, but just could not have been a lovelier guy. He chatted with us when he found out I was Canadian. Chatted with me about Canada, and I don't know if any of you have had a chance to see the episode I was on, but they were, just by pure luck, there were a couple of Canadian references that came up in that episode, and afterwards he was joking with me about them, and he took questions from the audience. Just an absolute lovely guy. And the last thing I'll say about that experience, which was just so much fun for me, is that the folks who run that show have the best job in the world. And I learned something about collaboration, because, we all think about, when we work in corporate environments, we all think about collaboration as, who you bring in on emails and who you copy and who gets invited to conference calls and who you consult with. But in producing a television show, what I saw is you had all these different specialists in their areas. And yes, there was a hierarchy, and none of them knew how to do anybody else's job. They only knew how to do their job. And so you had to have a high degree of trust that after spending a morning, because we started at 6 a.m., of everybody preparing and coming together at 11 a.m. to start taping, everybody's done their job and everyone will perform at their best, but you have to just trust. And that collaboration, to me, goes hand in hand with just trusting your colleagues and your coworkers. And as you can see, that show runs like clockwork. It gets 7 or 8 million viewers every night. It's a huge revenue source for the network that owns it. And it's just an excellent experience.
Wow.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that with us, Mahesh. I think normally I would switch to Michael, but I think I'll go right to Terry, our president and founder and number one dad, because I believe he has a question for you.
Well, I really do, Mahesh, and thanks very much for coming and sharing your world with us. Really, I was hoping Amy would ask this, and maybe she would later, but I think young people, and you remember when you were 18, we were watching this show, and they'll want to know what they can take from the Global Vision Program, the skills, the knowledge that they acquire with us, and use it in your world, get you to where you are today. Is there any relationship at all?
Oh, absolutely, Terry. And thanks, first of all, for having me today. And I've spoken about Global Vision to lots of people, and what I have often said to people, and I mean this from the heart, is that it changed the trajectory of my professional life. And I'll tell you how. I speak to Canadians every day, young Canadians who are looking for an international career, who are looking for a career that takes them all over the world, as mine has. I've been very fortunate to have traveled all around the world, met people from everywhere. And the thing I tell them is, you have to understand two things. One is that we are a small country, and that even though we have a great reputation, people like us a lot, people come in with some inbuilt biases towards us, that we don't like to leave our own country, we don't like to learn other languages, we don't really like to leave the wonderful, safe confines of our borders, because we have created a great place, a great society in which to live. And one of the things Global Vision taught me, just even as a Torontonian, was it took me out of my comfort zone. Having spent my whole life in Toronto until I was 18, and exposed me to people from all over my country, from parts of that country that I never have, never traveled to. But then it showed us our place in the world as well. Because when we went and we met Canadian businesses operating overseas, and we met Canadians working overseas and doing all sorts of things, I think it showed us that while we have a wonderful country and you could spend an entire career living and working in Canada and doing something very meaningful, you could connect Canada to the outside world in a way that we don't always think about. And whether it was meeting the principal of the Lycée in France, or whether it was meeting the folks at Bombardier, doing business in Europe, it helped me see kind of where our place in the world could be. And as an aside, because we spent a week at the start of Global Vision at Queen's University, it also exposed me to a place that ended up being very impactful in my life, because I did my undergrad at Queen's and would never have even thought to go there had I not spent some time at Global Vision there. But after graduating from Queen's and graduating from law school and practicing on Bay Street, I think that spark that Global Vision planted for me, which is to find a way to do what you love and what you're passionate about, but in a way that is global and that connects Canada to the world, really motivated me to go and look for other opportunities. And I've since met so many great Canadians. In fact, I have a group of folks that I get together with once a month here. We call the group Whiskey and Wisdom, which is a little bit of a grandiose name, but it's a group of transplanted Canadians who have had the exact same thoughts and experiences about connecting with the broader world, and bringing what we as Canadians have to offer to the larger world. And that I owe 110% to Global Vision.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. And Amy, can I allow one more short one here? Mahesh, imagine we finally get through this COVID thing, and how do you see the new normal? What will happen? Will it stay the same as it was before COVID, or do you see some changes, particularly in the countries that you deal with around the world?
Well, one of the things I'm worried about, not to get too dark, is I don't think we yet fully understand the health aspects of the crisis in a lot of developing countries. I think one of the things that's been strange about this crisis is the health part has hit the advanced economies first, and we're now moving probably into the social and financial impacts in the advanced economies. In the developing country, it seems to have gone in reverse. They're feeling the economic pinch first, and I hope the health pinch won't come as severely. But once that plays out, I think what we'll see is a real struggle that those of us who believe in international development, international business, in connecting markets, in open markets, and in free trade, will have a struggle reconnecting, the pieces that have been pulled apart by this virus. And I think it's going to take a huge commitment from all of us to do this, and to be honest with ourselves and say, okay, look, there had been this international system that had been built. It was fantastic. It was great in so many ways, but there were a lot of people that were being left behind by it, a lot of people that were underserved by it. And how can we not just go back to the old normal, but how can we have a new normal that doesn't throw away everything we've done in the past, but builds on it and makes it better? And I think if I could impart one thing to younger people kind of coming up in this world of JTC and looking internationally, is to really commit to doing that, right? Figuring it out, figure out how do we do this in a way that really serves more people. I think that's going to be our big challenge.
Thanks very much, Mahesh. That's a great challenge you've set out, and I'm sure our young Canadians will be up for it, just like you were in 1991. So good to see you here. Amy.
You as well.
Yes, thanks. Thanks, Mahesh. If you could just stay with us, we'd love to ask you a few things informally after. But now I'd like to throw to my Calgary correspondent, Michael Batas, joining us live.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the Some Great Newsroom desk as we have here today. First I'd like to talk about is, of course, we want to pay tribute to Nova Scotia and the hardship they're going through right now. While it is a tough time of tragedy, I would like to say that there is a good news story to report on today. So shortly after the tragedy, there was a pilot who decided to go on a flight in Nova Scotia over the area that was affected by the massacre. And he did go fly in a heart formation, which was a show of solidarity and respect to those who lost their lives. I thought that was a great news story to share and something that shows the true fabric of who Canadians are. And moving on today, we also would like to recognize it is the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And it's an excellent day today for the climate, especially considering in North America alone, emissions are down up to 30% in major cities across the country. So it's been a great win for the environment, and it's a very interesting insight to see what it'll be like if we relied on a less carbon-intensive environment for a more environmentally conscious future. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Well, we'd like to end this episode today by encouraging all of our families and friends across the country to stay home, stay safe, stay healthy and strong, right? We lit a candle here in the GV HQ kitchen for all of our good friends in Nova Scotia. We're thinking about you, and we are here as a nation to take care of one another and be good. And you heard it all here at Global Vision. Please feel free to send us your great news stories, and we'd love to stay connected with you. Stay safe, everyone.